So welcome back to Orca Boats. I'm Rod. We're working on the PT11
and in this episode I'm going to sand and fair the bottom of the boat and then fiberglass the hull. I've filled all the nail holes, all the staple holes, all of the low spots in the hull with epoxy and fairing compound, and now I'm just using my orbital sander with 120 grit, being very careful not to sand the chines. We'll do that by hand. So I'm just using minimal pressure here, making sure that the soft pad on the orbital sander does not roll over the chines.
Yesterday I took the orbital sander to both halves, cleaned up all of the filler to get a bit of a smooth surface. There's a few small little areas where I found little pinholes. I really didn't want those in there because in glassing you get a little bit of air bubbles popping out, so I filled a few small areas that I thought needed attention. And today I put the boat together for final fairing, because the important thing is that the boat is one piece when it starts to smooth out surfaces between chines, so that the chine line is a nice clean crisp line from bow to stern. So that's what we're going to do today. It'll basically be hand sanding with a fairing board, block sanding, and cleaning it all up. Then I'll take it apart and glass it. So before I put my mask on, I'm not able to speak. I'm just taking a simple board, a good stiff board with some 80 grit sandpaper, and I'm going to sand these last little areas to across the seam like this, so that I get a nice crisp chine line and get rid of the last little bits of rough epoxy. So here we go. And the reason we put the boat back together for the final fairing is that at the join line here, I want to make sure that the chine edge is fair all the way through the boat. Otherwise, I could sand both pieces separately, put them together when the boat is done with a nice high gloss or paint on here. It might become very obvious that these lines here don't kind of line up and the boat looks a little off. So we're going to sand across the join line here to get a nice sharp crisp edge all the way through. And the last thing I'm going to do just by hand is got to get into the fillet here in the corner, because the glass will wrap down and onto the outwale. Now we'll just vacuum it up. Then before taking the boat back apart for glassing, what I want to do is just get down here and look at these lines. Everything looks pretty smooth. I'm looking down the chines here, making sure it's not waving. If I've sanded one panel more than the other, and you have a little bit of an indentation. It's going to look very odd under paint, but it looks pretty nice. I've also rounded the corners, just slightly. They're not sharp corners, but.
And with the majority of the dust vacuumed off, just going to open up the shop door, blast the air out, and then I wipe down the hull with a clean rag, taking the rag outside off and giving it a good shake.
So let's quickly go through the step that's going to be the process of fiberglassing both halves of the hull here. Putting 6-ounce glass, which will wrap up from the outwale to wherever, and a little bit of overhang on the outwale. This is going to be day one. I'm going to fiberglass these two halves with the 4 pieces. And then tomorrow I will likely flip the boat back over and do some work on the top side, allowing this epoxy to set for a couple of days. Then the boats will get back over upside down, and a heavier 9-ounce cloth will go on the very bottom of the boat, overlapping onto the 6-ounce. On the outboard surface of the outwhales, I can do a 4-ounce glass in the transom. So this is sort of a 3 or 4 day project of glass, one section, flip it, do another section, flip it back, do another section, and then after it's all cured and hard, sand it all down. There'll be a little bit of fairing in around the curve here, especially with the heavier glass overlapping the 6-ounce. We can sand a bit of it down, but most of it will be used with thickened epoxy and fairing compound to get a very smooth surface before paint. So, just going to roll out a piece of 6-ounce glass and make a cut. So it doesn't need to overhang the ends very much at all, if any. So we'll cut this. Now we just need to determine the center of this piece of glass, as I need to cut it down the middle and slide it down each side. So it's 25 1/2 inches, because this is 51 inch wide, so we're just going to go right about here. If I'm able to grab one of these threads, might be able to mark. So it's not going to be visible on the camera, but I can see a line down there now. Then each one of these pieces literally just slides down so that it will tuck onto the in whale and hang out past the outwhale, just past it by 1/4 of an inch or so. So with that piece in place, I will stick a couple of push pins into there so I don't lose where it is. And I can kind of fold that back without it falling on the ground and work on side 2. Okay, I don't need this much of an overlap at the bow, so I'm going to just trim back here on the first side so it comes up onto the bottom of the boat by 1 inch or 2. And we'll come around from one side to the other by 1 inch. There's a bit of tricky trimming here. Just kind of want to pull it into the boat and find where it wants to wrap around. It's going to create quite a bit of excess epoxy that will need to be faired out. So as I pull this piece around by 1 inch, pull that one back a little bit more. These pieces will lay down on their own quite nicely. There's no push pins required here, but I just want to make sure that any excess glass is pushed up onto the bottom of the boat. Alright, I have the 4 pieces of glass on the 2 halves here, so we're ready to mix up some epoxy. I'll be using a combination of epoxy rollers and pouring the epoxy on and spreading it around with a plastic spreader. I find that a little bit faster and easier, but on near the edges where there's strands everywhere, the roller will be best at just pushing that down. And I'm also using a second piece of roller to just absorb up any excess. But I will be using the epoxy spreader method to just squeegee off any excess epoxy as it runs down the side of the boat.
So I'm starting on the bow section, and because there's more vertical surfaces on this half of the boat, I'm just going to anchor the piece of glass on both sides with some epoxy and a brush. That way when I start to use the spreader, I'm not just going to be shifting the glass around. Then I moved to my epoxy spreader, just poured epoxy on and spread it around, and now I'm just removing some of the excess. And now I'm just following up with a epoxy foam roller, pushing the glass down. The roller does absorb a little bit of the excess, but also leaves a nice smooth surface. And with one side done, just move on to the side 2 and follow the same procedure. And once I'm happy that the bow section is all saturated and smooth, I can move on to the stern section and just follow the same procedure. And with the 2 halves done, and about 3 or 4 hours later, I'll be able to come back and roll on a second coat of epoxy straight out of a paint tray.
So it doesn't take very long to apply all the epoxy on there out of the paint tray, maybe 10-15 minutes. Rolling it this way, that way, making sure it's an even coat. And just to make sure that we don't have any runs or texture of roller bubbles, just going to tip it all off with a large disposable chip brush. And we just brush back and forth. You can kind of feel the heavy areas. The brush will glide through it smoother. You can move it about. But really we're just trying to get rid of that odd texture, almost like which will end up feeling like a sandpaper surface if I don't tip it off from the roller. Okay, so we're just going to divide this piece of heavy 9-ounce glass in half. It's 50.5, so we'll go with 25 inches. It should be about right here. And then to get a nice trim edge on the overhang of the glass, I'm going to add some tape here, just following that chine mark. So what we're going to do is lay the glass over the tape, and when it's beginning to cure but still green, you can just cut along the tape and get a nice clean edge. I'll put down 2 layers here just for thickness. And then maybe go back down a little bit further. So I'll do this on all 4 sides. Okay, laying the glass down, and we're just going to cut off a bit of a taper here. Because that piece will lay just over the bow here. Not too far, I don't know how well it will conform. Probably down to about here. And I'll trim, I don't need 2 huge layers of glass. So I'm just going to butt them up together. Then wet that out.
So being that the bottom of the boat is very flat, it's pretty easy to just pour out a puddle of epoxy, spread it around with a squeegee. Now the 9-ounce glass will need more epoxy before it starts to clear, so rather than trying to force any epoxy in or add any more, just giving it some time, letting it soak in, and eventually the glass will start to clear. And then I just try to use my epoxy spreader to pull little bits of epoxy and touch it down the sides. I don't want it running down the boat too much, so I'm just going to try and cover the glass up until and over top of the green tape. You'll also notice on the rear section here there is no epoxy. That is where the centerboard trunk box is. I certainly don't want to be pouring epoxy or spreading with my spreader and having it run down inside the box. So I'll just pour a little epoxy nearby and then let the roller soak it in that area.
So now I've got the two pieces of heavy fiberglass on the bottom hull portion of each half with the green tape. I'll likely just come back in about an hour and I'll take a really sharp razor knife to cut along the tape edge and remove the overhang. I have also glassed the second side of the foils and wrapped a piece of glass around the foil box. Alright, it's been about an hour or so since I put the glass on over the tape. Now the objective here is to cut along the edge of the tape with a very sharp razor blade. So very nice, sharp, clean edge on the glass. Just pulling very slowly just in case I haven't cut all the way through. I'm going to end up pulling the glass off the hull, which I don't really want to do at this point in time. Just do that with the other four sides. We've got a nice clean edge to sand down later. And as always, thanks for tuning in. If you wish to become a subscriber, be sure to hit the subscribe button. Maybe click that bell and that'll notify you of updates on this build and other builds going on in the shop.